Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a forgotten year when the harvest failed, the granaries emptied, and ordinary people were forced to decide what could still be called food. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in, perhaps dim the lights, and imagine a cold wind moving across endless fields beneath a gray medieval sky. Our story begins in the year 1317, in the small village of Ashmere. The village stood beside a shallow river in a distant corner of a kingdom, whose kings rarely visited the lands they ruled. Most people in Ashmere had never traveled farther than a day's walk from their homes. Their world consisted of muddy roads, wooden cottages, a stone church, and fields that stretched toward dark forests on the horizon. For generations, the villagers had lived according to a rhythm that never seemed to change. Spring brought planting, summer brought labor, autumn brought harvest, winter brought patience. But this year, something had gone terribly wrong. Rain had fallen for months. Not gentle rain, not refreshing rain. Instead, endless sheets of cold water poured from the heavens, as though the sky itself had cracked open. The fields drowned. Seeds rotted beneath the soil. Hay turned black before it could be stored. Even the chickens appeared thinner than usual. The villagers had watched the clouds with growing unease. But at first, nobody spoke openly about famine. People preferred hope. Hope was easier than fear. Among the villagers lived a man named Thomas. Thomas was 34 years old and worked a small strip of land inherited from his father. His cottage stood near the edge of Ashmere, beside a narrow path lined with thorn bushes. Inside lived his wife Margaret, their son Edwin, their daughter Alice, and Thomas's elderly mother Eleanor. The cottage was small. One room, a hearth, a table, a few stools, bundles of straw for sleeping. Nothing luxurious, nothing unusual. Like most villagers, they owned little, yet only a year earlier they had considered themselves fortunate. Their harvest had been decent. Their goat produced milk. The children rarely went hungry. Now those memories already felt distant. One damp morning, Thomas awoke before sunrise. The roof dripped steadily. Tiny droplets struck the packed earth floor. Margaret sat beside the hearth, trying to warm a pot containing the last of their barley porridge. The amount inside looked alarmingly small. Thomas watched silently. Nobody wanted to calculate how many meals remained. Doing so would force them to confront an answer. They did not wish to know. Outside, church bells echoed through the village. Not festive bells, work bells. The Lord's steward was summoning laborers. Thomas pulled on his worn boots and stepped into the rain. Mud swallowed his footsteps. The village center looked miserable. Dogs searched for scraps. Children stood quietly beside their mothers. Nobody laughed. Even conversations had become shorter in recent weeks. People saved energy wherever they could. Near the church stood the steward, a narrow-faced man named Walter. he carried a parchment listing taxes and obligations. Walter announced that despite poor harvests, grain payments remained due. The Lord required his share. The king required his share. The church required its share. Rain or sunshine changed nothing. The villagers listened without protest. Complaints rarely improved circumstances. Thomas returned home that evening exhausted. Margaret served supper, a single loaf made from coarse rye flour, a handful of onions, a cup of thin broth. Their son, Edwin, ate slowly. Even at 12 years old, he understood that every bite mattered. After the meal, Eleanor sat near the fire and told stories from her childhood. She spoke of another hungry year long ago, a year when villagers mixed acorns into bread, a year when people gathered roots, usually fed to animals. Thomas listened carefully. At the time, those stories had seemed distant, almost unbelievable. Now they felt like warnings. Weeks passed. The rain continued. The village mill produced less flour each day. Farmers who once sold grain now purchased whatever little remained. Prices climbed steadily upward, then climbed again. Soon, even simple bread became difficult to obtain. One afternoon, Thomas visited the marketplace in a nearby town. The journey took nearly 3 hours. He hoped to buy grain. Instead, he discovered panic. Merchants argued with customers. Sacks disappeared within minutes of arriving. Guards watched over food stores. People whispered alarming rumors. Entire villages were running short of supplies. Roadside thefts had increased. Some travelers carried clubs for protection. Others simply stayed home. Thomas returned empty-handed. That night, Margaret cried quietly after the children fell asleep. She believed nobody noticed. Thomas noticed. He simply lacked words that could help. Winter approached. The first frost appeared earlier than expected. The remaining vegetables in village gardens withered. A sense of dread settled over Ashmere. Then came the day everyone remembered. The village baker closed his doors. For nearly 20 years, the baker had produced bread 6 days each week. Now he possessed no flour. The ovens went cold. People gathered outside, staring at the locked building. No speeches were given. No dramatic scenes unfolded. Just silence. Sometimes silence communicates disaster better than any announcement. As winter deepened, villagers began searching for alternatives. At first, they collected nuts, overlooked during autumn. Children explored forests, gathering anything edible. Women dug for roots. Men trapped small animals. Every possible source of nourishment gained value. Thomas spent hours wandering woodland paths. He carried a basket and returned with whatever nature offered. Beech nuts, wild berries preserved by the cold, mushrooms when fortune allowed. Most discoveries were disappointing. The forest fed many people poorly. One evening, Eleanor revealed a forgotten practice from her youth. She showed Margaret how to dry and grind acorns. The process took took considerable effort. The bitter taste required repeated washing. Even then, the resulting flour produced unpleasant bread. But unpleasant bread remained bread. The family began mixing acorn meal with remaining rye flour. The loaves became darker, heavier, stranger, yet they filled empty stomachs. For a while, soon even acorns grew scarce. Hundreds of villagers searched the same woods. Nothing remained hidden for long. Then another food appeared upon the tables of Ashmere. Tree bark, not entire pieces of bark, rather the soft inner layer beneath it. People stripped sections from certain trees, dried them, crushed them, and mixed the material into bread. The result resembled food, only in the most generous sense. It tasted woody, bitter, difficult to chew, yet families consumed it gratefully. Hunger changes expectations. A meal no longer needed to be enjoyable. It merely needed to exist. One snowy evening, Thomas sat beside the hearth, examining a loaf containing bark flour, acorn meal, and only a trace of actual grain. The loaf looked almost gray. Edwin took a bite and forced himself to smile. Alice copied her brother's bravery. Margaret lowered her eyes. Nobody mentioned the taste. The fire crackled softly. Wind rattled the cottage walls. Outside, snow drifted across empty fields where crops should have grown. Thomas wondered how many villagers lay awake, asking the same question. How much worse could things become? Unfortunately, the answer would arrive sooner than anyone expected, because before winter ended, Ashmere would discover foods that previous generations had never imagined eating, and some villagers would cross lines that hunger had once made unthinkable. The first sign came 3 days later, when Thomas followed a trail into the frozen forest and noticed smoke rising from a place where no cottage should have stood. Curious and uneasy, he stepped between snow-covered trees and approached carefully. What he discovered there would change everything he believed about survival. Thomas paused beside a cluster of frost-covered pines and watched the thin ribbon of smoke drift upward into the pale winter sky. The forest around him remained silent. No birds sang. No animals moved through the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed hesitant. He tightened his grip on the basket hanging from his arm and stepped forward carefully. The smoke came from a small clearing hidden among the trees. There, standing between ancient oaks, was a crude shelter built from branches, old wagon boards, and scraps of cloth. Thomas had never seen it before. No path led to it. No tracks remained visible beneath the recent snowfall. For a moment, he wondered whether he should turn around and return home. Yet curiosity proved stronger than caution. He approached slowly. As he neared the shelter, a smell drifted through the cold air. It was not the scent of bread, nor was it the smell of meat. Instead, it carried a strange, earthy bitterness. Something boiled inside a dented iron pot, suspended over a fire. A figure emerged from the shelter. The man appeared thin enough to vanish in a strong wind. His beard was long and tangled. His coat consisted of patched wool stitched together so many times that its original shape had disappeared. Thomas recognized him after several moments. His name was Robert. Once he had lived in a neighboring village several miles away. Thomas had not seen him for years. "Robert?" Thomas asked. The man blinked in surprise. Thomas neither smiled. The times had stolen such habits. Thomas glanced toward the pot. "What are you cooking?" Robert hesitated. Then he lifted the wooden lid. Inside floated a thick gray stew. Thomas frowned. He recognized no vegetables, no grain, no meat. Nothing looked familiar. "What is it?" he asked. Robert stirred the mixture slowly. "Mostly moss." Thomas stared. "Moss?" Robert nodded. "The kind that grows on rocks and old trees. Some can be eaten if boiled long enough." The words sounded absurd. A year earlier, Thomas would have laughed. Now he merely listened. "We wash it first," Robert explained. "Then boil it again and again." "Does it taste good?" A faint smile appeared on Robert's face. "Nothing tastes good anymore." Thomas could not argue. Robert invited him closer to the fire. For nearly an hour they sat together. During that time, Thomas learned disturbing things. The neighboring village had suffered even worse than Ashmere. Several families had abandoned their homes. Others wandered the countryside, searching for work. A few had disappeared entirely. Nobody knew where they had gone. More alarming were the stories about food. People had begun eating things that previous generations considered emergency supplies for only the most desperate circumstances. Ground acorns, tree bark, wild roots, nettles, moss, certain weeds, even leather. That last revelation surprised Thomas most. "Leather," he repeated. Robert nodded. Shoes, belts, old harnesses. Thomas thought he had misunderstood. Robert continued. "They scrape away the dirt, boil the leather for hours, sometimes days." Thomas felt a chill, unrelated to winter. "And then they eat it." When the choice is leather or nothing, people become creative. The statement lingered in Thomas's thoughts long after he left the clearing. As evening approached, he returned to Ashmere. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The sky darkened rapidly. When he entered the cottage, Margaret immediately noticed his troubled expression. He told the family about Robert, about the moss stew, about the boiled leather. Alice looked horrified. Edwin remained unusually quiet. Eleanor simply stared into the fire. Finally, the old woman nodded. "It happened before." Everyone turned toward her. "When I was a child, there was an old man who boiled saddle straps." Thomas looked surprised. "You never mentioned that." "Because nobody likes remembering hungry years." The cottage fell silent. Outside, snow tapped softly against the walls. Inside, the small fire offered little warmth. For the first time, Thomas realized that stories he once considered impossible might become reality. The famine worsened as winter stretched onward. Days became difficult to distinguish from one another. Every morning brought the same gray sky. Every evening brought the same uncertainty. Food disappeared steadily. The village baker remained closed. The mill operated only occasionally. Many households survived on thin soups containing little more than hot water, and whatever scraps could be found. Children grew thinner. Faces appeared sharper. Movements became slower. People conserved strength without even realizing it. One afternoon, Thomas walked through the village and noticed something unusual. The dogs had disappeared. Not all of them, but many. The village once echoed with barking. Now the roads felt strangely quiet. He knew what that silence meant. Nobody discussed it openly. Nobody needed to. Hunger explained enough. The church attempted to provide comfort. Father Benedict held regular prayers. Villagers gathered beneath the stone roof, seeking reassurance. The priest spoke of endurance, patience, faith, hope. Yet Thomas noticed something changing. Attendance increased, not because faith had grown stronger, because church gatherings offered warmth. People sat together inside thick stone walls, simply to escape the cold for a little while. Sometimes survival begins with small comforts. One evening after prayers, Father Benedict approached Thomas. The priest appeared exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. "How is your family?" he asked. Thomas answered honestly, "We still have enough for a few weeks, maybe less." The priest nodded slowly. "Many have less." Thomas already suspected that. Father Benedict lowered his voice. "I visited the eastern cottages yesterday." Thomas waited. "A family there is making soup from straw." The words sounded ridiculous, yet the priest spoke seriously. "They boil it repeatedly. The water absorbs a little flavor from whatever grain once touched it." Thomas struggled to imagine such a meal. A bowl of flavored water and softened straw. The famine seemed to invent new levels of hardship each week. As February approached, rumors spread through Ashmere. Travelers arriving from distant towns brought troubling reports. Roads were crowded with wandering families. Monasteries received more beggars than they could support. Food prices had reached unimaginable heights. In some places, guards protected granaries day and night. Elsewhere, desperate thefts occurred regularly. The kingdom appeared to be unraveling thread by thread. Then one morning, an event occurred that nobody expected. A merchant arrived. His wagon rolled into the village square, beneath weak sunlight. Immediately villagers gathered around him. Hope surged through Ashmere like a sudden spark. Perhaps he carried grain, perhaps flour, perhaps dried peas. Something, anything. The merchant climbed down from the wagon. His expression quickly extinguished their optimism. The wagon contained food, but not enough, nowhere near enough. Several sacks of oats, a few barrels of beans, some dried fish. The quantity might have supplied the village for days. Not months, days. Even worse, the prices were staggering. Most families could not afford them. Arguments erupted. Voices rose. A few people begged. Others cursed. The merchant remained firm. He claimed he had paid enormous sums to acquire the goods. Perhaps he spoke truthfully. Perhaps not. Either way, the outcome remained unchanged. The wealthy purchased first. The poor watched. Thomas spent nearly all his remaining coins on a small sack of oats. When he carried it home, Margaret looked relieved. For the first time in weeks, genuine hope appeared in her eyes. That night, they prepared oat porridge. Nothing fancy, nothing remarkable, yet the smell alone felt luxurious. Alice smiled while eating. Edwin asked for a second bowl. Even Eleanor laughed softly. For a brief evening, the cottage almost felt normal again. The memory lasted exactly 4 days. That was how long the oats survived. Then the sack stood empty. The old fear returned. Winter still refused to loosen its grip. Snow continued to cover the fields. No green shoots emerged. No signs of spring appeared. One night Thomas awoke unexpectedly. The cottage was dark. Only faint embers glowed within the hearth. At first he heard nothing. Then came a sound, a scraping noise. Outside, Thomas rose quietly and moved toward the door. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate. He opened the door slightly. Moonlight illuminated the snowy yard. There, beside the goat shed, stood a figure. The person froze when spotted. Thomas recognized him immediately. It was Martin Fletcher, a farmer from the western side of the village. His cheeks appeared hollow. His clothing hung loosely from his body. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Martin lowered his head. "I wasn't stealing the goat." Thomas remained silent. Martin swallowed hard. "I was gathering the droppings." Thomas frowned. "The droppings?" Martin nodded miserably. "My wife heard they can be burned after drying." The explanation struck Thomas harder than any confession. Martin had not come seeking food. He had come seeking fuel. Even firewood had become scarce. People now searched for warmth with the same desperation once reserved for meals. Thomas looked at the exhausted man standing in the snow. Then he opened the shed and handed him a small bundle of wood. Not much, only enough for a night or two. Martin stared at it as though receiving treasure. His eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." Thomas nodded. The farmer disappeared into the darkness. Long afterward, Thomas remained awake. He listened to the wind. He listened to his family, breathing softly, and he wondered how many more boundaries would vanish before spring arrived. Because beyond Ashmere, beyond the forests and frozen roads, a new danger was already approaching. A danger far worse than bark bread, moss stew, or boiled leather, for famine rarely travels alone, and soon disease would begin following hunger through the kingdom. The first signs appeared so quietly that most people failed to notice them. A cough here, a fever there, a farmer too weak to leave his bed, a child unable to keep food down. At first, the villagers of Ashmere assumed it was merely another hardship among many. After all, winter brought illness every year. People became sick. People recovered. Life continued. But this winter felt different. The cold lingered longer. The hunger dug deeper. And bodies already weakened by months of poor nutrition struggled to fight even minor infections. Thomas first heard the rumors while drawing water from the village well. Two women stood nearby, speaking in hushed voices. Their faces carried the strained expressions that had become common throughout Ashmere. "The cooper's wife died yesterday," one woman whispered. The other nodded. "And his youngest son." Thomas paused. The cooper's family had seemed healthy only weeks earlier. He carried the bucket home with an uneasy feeling settling inside his chest. The village already battled one enemy. Now another appeared to be arriving. That evening Margaret noticed his concern. What happened? Thomas told her about the conversation. Margaret glanced toward the children. Alice sat near the fire, wrapped in a blanket. Edwin repaired a wooden spoon whose handle had cracked. Neither child seemed aware of the fear slowly spreading through the village. Margaret lowered her voice. "If sickness comes here," she left the sentence unfinished. No explanation was necessary. The family possessed little food. Their bodies were growing weaker. A serious illness could prove disastrous. Outside, the wind rattled the cottage walls. Inside, nobody slept particularly well. The following days brought more troubling news. Several villagers fell ill. A shepherd developed a fever that left him unable to stand. An elderly widow stopped leaving her cottage entirely. The blacksmith's apprentice spent 3 days confined to bed. Most recovered eventually. A few did not. Father Benedict found himself conducting more funerals than baptisms. The churchyard expanded steadily. Fresh graves appeared wherever the frozen ground allowed digging. Sometimes the soil proved too hard. When that happened, villagers waited for slightly warmer days before completing burials. Death had become familiar, not accepted, never accepted, but familiar. Meanwhile, hunger continued shaping daily life. The small food stores remaining throughout Ashmere vanished one by one. People became increasingly inventive in their search for nourishment. Thomas witnessed examples almost every day. One afternoon, he discovered several villagers gathering beside a patch of frozen marshland. Curious, he approached. The group knelt in the mud, using sticks and crude tools. "What are they doing?" he asked an elderly man nearby. The old man pointed toward the ground. "Digging for roots." Thomas looked again. The roots appeared thin, hardly worth the effort. Yet dozens of people worked diligently. Every scrap mattered now. Children collected the smallest pieces. Women carried baskets filled with muddy vegetation. Nobody complained. Hunger transformed even unpleasant labor into opportunity. A week later, another strange food appeared in Ashmere. Nettle soup. Under ordinary circumstances, nettles were considered little more than troublesome weeds. Touching them caused painful stings. Now villagers searched eagerly for every surviving patch. Boiled long enough, the leaves softened into something edible. The flavor remained bitter. The texture left much to be desired. Yet bowls of nettle soup appeared on tables throughout the village. Thomas and his family joined them. One evening, Margaret served a pot containing nettles, onion scraps, and water. The meal looked uninspiring. Even so, nobody left hungry. That counted as success. For a time, then came another discovery, or perhaps desperation would be a more accurate word. A traveling laborer passing through Ashmere shared a method he had seen elsewhere. Certain villagers began collecting dried peas that had fallen onto barn floors months earlier. The peas were often damaged. Some had been trampled into dirt, others partially rotted. Yet people cleaned them carefully and added them to stews. Nothing could be wasted. Not anymore. The famine had changed the meaning of value. Things once ignored became precious. Things once discarded became meals. One cloudy morning, Thomas accompanied Edwin into the forest. The boy had grown noticeably thinner during winter. His face looked older somehow. Not physically older, simply more serious. Like many children during difficult times, he matured faster than circumstances should have required. They spent hours searching beneath trees. Occasionally, they uncovered nuts hidden by squirrels. Sometimes they found edible roots. Most often, they found nothing. As afternoon approached, Edwin stopped beside a fallen log. "Father," Thomas turned. The boy pointed towards several mushrooms growing from damp wood. Neither spoke for several moments. Wild mushrooms presented danger. Some could be eaten, others could kill. In prosperous years, villagers rarely took such risks. Now many did. Thomas examined them carefully. He believed they were safe. Believed, not knew. That uncertainty disturbed him. Eventually, he shook his head. "Leave them." Edwin looked disappointed. "But they might be good. They might." Thomas glanced at the mushrooms. "They might also be our last meal." The boy understood. They continued walking. Behind them, the mushrooms remained untouched. A small victory against desperation. Not everyone showed similar caution. Within days, several villagers became ill after eating unfamiliar plants. Most recovered. One nearly died. Rumors spread quickly afterward. Yet the risks continued. People facing starvation often calculate danger differently. An uncertain meal may appear preferable to certain hunger. As February slowly gave way to March, subtle changes emerged. Snow melted during daylight hours. Small patches of earth became visible. The river began moving more freely. Hope stirred throughout Ashmere. Spring approached. Not fully, not yet, but enough to remind people that winter could not last forever. Unfortunately, spring alone could not solve every problem. The previous year's harvest remained lost. Food stores remained nearly empty, and many villagers had become dangerously weak. One evening, Father Benedict called a gathering at the church. Nearly everyone attended. The priest stood before the crowd looking exhausted. Months of hardship had affected him no less than anyone else. "We must help one another," he said. His voice echoed through the stone building. "If families possess extra food, share what you can." The suggestion produced uneasy silence, not because people disagreed, because few possessed anything extra. Still, some assistance occurred. Neighbors exchanged small favors: a handful of oats, a piece of dried fish, a few onions. Nothing grand, nothing sufficient to solve the famine, yet enough to remind villagers they remained a community rather than isolated sufferers. For several weeks, Ashmere endured. Barely, but endured. Then a traveler arrived carrying stories from distant towns. The man stopped at the village square and accepted a bowl of soup in exchange for news. People gathered around him eagerly. Information had become almost as valuable as food. The traveler spoke of entire regions affected by famine, roads crowded with wandering families, monasteries overwhelmed by requests for aid, markets charging impossible prices. Then he mentioned something that captured everyone's attention. In certain cities, people had begun eating animals normally ignored. Cats, rats, crows, anything that could be caught. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some villagers appeared shocked. Others looked thoughtful. Thomas noticed both reactions. Later that evening, he reflected upon the conversation while sitting beside the hearth. Months earlier, such stories would have sounded horrifying. Now they merely sounded sad. The famine had steadily shifted everyone's understanding of survival. Each month introduced practices previously considered unimaginable. Then those practices became ordinary. The progression frightened him. How far could necessity push people? How many boundaries remained? The answer arrived sooner than expected. A few days later, Thomas traveled to a neighboring village seeking work. He hoped to earn food rather than coin. Coin had become less useful when food itself remained scarce. The journey took several hours. When he finally arrived, he immediately noticed how empty the village felt. Many cottages stood abandoned. Doors hung open. Gardens lay neglected. The place seemed haunted. Near the center of the settlement, he met an elderly woman tending a small fire. She agreed to speak with him. Their conversation revealed a grim reality. Many families had left searching for better conditions elsewhere. Some headed toward larger towns. Others sought monasteries. A few simply wandered. Nobody knew whether they found success. Before leaving, Thomas noticed something cooking in the woman's pot. The smell seemed familiar, yet strange. "What is it?" he asked. The woman hesitated, then answered honestly, "Bean husks." Thomas blinked. The husks normally discarded after beans were removed. The scraps, the waste, the parts nobody wanted. The woman stirred the pot. "We boil them until they're soft." Thomas stared at the meal. Another reminder, another line crossed, another adjustment to what counted as food. When he finally returned to Ashmere, dusk had fallen. Margaret listened quietly as he described what he had seen. The abandoned homes, the wandering families, the bean husk soup. Neither spoke afterward. Words seemed unnecessary. The famine continued, teaching the same lesson again and again. People could survive on far less than they once imagined. Yet survival carried a cost. Not merely physical. Something happened to the spirit as well. Something difficult to describe. A constant weight. A constant uncertainty. A constant awareness that tomorrow's meal remained unknown. As March progressed, green shoots finally emerged from the earth. Small, fragile, yet unmistakable. Villagers noticed immediately. For the first time in many months, genuine smiles appeared. Children pointed excitedly toward patches of fresh growth. Women gathered early herbs. Men inspected fields. Hope returned cautiously. Nobody trusted it completely. Not after such a winter. Still it returned. But while Ashmere looked toward spring, another shadow was already moving toward the village, along the muddy roads of the kingdom. A group of starving travelers, dozens of them, men, women, and children who had lost everything. And when they finally reached Ashmere, they would bring stories so disturbing that even the hardships of winter would seem merciful by comparison. The travelers arrived on a gray morning beneath low clouds that seemed determined never to leave the kingdom. Thomas first noticed them while repairing a section of fence near his cottage. At a distance, they appeared almost like a moving shadow stretching across the muddy road. As they drew closer, individual figures became visible. Men, women, children, an elderly man leaning on a stick, a young mother carrying a sleeping infant, several boys pulling a crude cart whose wheels creaked with every rotation. There were far more of them than anyone expected. Perhaps 30, perhaps 40. Thomas stopped working and watched silently. Other villagers emerged from cottages and gathered near the road. Nobody spoke at first. The newcomers looked exhausted. Their clothing hung loosely from their bodies. Their faces appeared gaunt. Many walked with the slow, deliberate movements of people who had spent months conserving every ounce of strength. The group halted near the village square. Father Benedict arrived shortly afterward. So did Walter the steward. The contrast between the two men immediately became apparent. The priest looked concerned. The steward looked irritated. One of the travelers stepped forward. He introduced himself as Matthew. His beard was streaked with gray despite an age that suggested he should have been much younger. Hunger had a way of aging people. "Our village is gone," Matthew said. The words fell heavily over the crowd. "Gone?" Father Benedict asked. Matthew nodded. The harvest failed 2 years in a row. A murmur moved through the villagers. 2 years. Ashmere had suffered greatly from one failed harvest. The thought of enduring another seemed unbearable. Matthew continued. First people sold livestock, then tools, then furniture. His voice remained calm. Too calm, like someone who had repeated the story many times. When that wasn't enough, families left. He paused briefly. Eventually, there wasn't much village left to stay in. Nobody knew how to respond. Even Walter remained silent. The travelers received permission to remain for several days. There was little food available, but Ashmere could not simply turn them away. Not entirely. The villagers shared what they could. A bowl of soup here, a piece of bread there. Small acts, tiny sacrifices, yet meaningful. That evening, Matthew sat beside Thomas outside the cottage. The sun hovered low on the horizon. For the first time in months, patches of green appeared among the fields. Spring was slowly awakening. Still, neither man spoke about the weather. Instead, Thomas asked the question that had lingered in his thoughts all day. How bad did it become? Matthew stared toward the fatting light. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he answered, "Worse than I ever believed possible." Thomas waited. Matthew sighed. "We ate everything." The words sounded simple, yet Thomas understood their weight. "What do you mean by everything?" Matthew looked down at his hands. "Everything." His voice lowered. The grain disappeared first, then the vegetables. He swallowed, then livestock. Thomas nodded. That much seemed predictable. Matthew continued. When livestock ran out, people trapped whatever animals remained. He paused again. Rabbits, birds, rats. The silence between them grew heavier. Eventually, Matthew spoke once more. "We even boiled old bones." Thomas frowned. "Old bones from previous meals." "We smashed them apart and boiled them again." Thomas stared. Matthew noticed his expression. You'd be surprised how long hunger can make a bone seem useful. The statement lingered in the air. A few months earlier, Thomas might have doubted such a story. Now he believed every word. The famine had already revealed enough strange realities. What shocked him most was not the behavior itself. It was how logical it sounded. The next few days brought additional stories. Each seemed more unsettling than the last. One woman described families collecting grain kernels from animal droppings. Another spoke of scraping mold from old food and eating the remainder. An elderly traveler claimed he had seen people digging through refuse heaps, searching for anything remotely edible. Some villagers questioned these tales. Others accepted them immediately. Thomas belonged to the latter group. After everything he had witnessed during winter, little seemed impossible. One afternoon, Margaret invited a traveler named Agnes into their cottage. The woman appeared around 40 years old, though hardship made age difficult to judge. She carried a small bundle containing all her possessions. While sharing a bowl of nettle soup, Agnes described the famine in her region. Her words fascinated and disturbed the family equally. In the beginning, Agnes explained, everyone believed the crisis would pass. Margaret nodded. That matched Ashmere's experience. People always expected improvement. Soon, next month, next season. Eventually, Agnes continued. Then the months kept passing. She stared into the soup. The problem with hunger is that it arrives slowly. Nobody interrupted. Each week feels manageable. Then suddenly, you realize you've spent half a year waiting for things to improve. Thomas thought about that long after she finished speaking. The observation felt painfully accurate. The famine had not descended overnight. It had crept forward one day at a time. One disappointing harvest, one empty cupboard, one reduced meal, one difficult decision, then another, and another, until life itself transformed. Meanwhile, spring strengthened. Green shoots spread across fields. Trees developed tiny buds. Birdsong gradually returned to the countryside. The changes lifted spirits throughout Ashmere, not dramatically, not enough to erase hardship, but enough to remind people that winter had finally ended. The villagers began gathering fresh plants wherever possible. Young nettles appeared again. Wild garlic emerged from damp soil. Certain edible herbs returned. For the first time in months, bowls contained something green that had not been dried or preserved. The improvement felt miraculous. Children especially benefited. Alice laughed more often. Edwin regained a little energy. Even Eleanor seemed stronger. Yet the famine remained far from over. New crops still required months to mature. The village existed in a dangerous gap between survival and recovery. Food shortages continued. One failed planting season could destroy everything. Everyone understood that, which made the next development particularly alarming. The Lord's officials arrived. 3 mounted men entered Ashmere one morning. Their horses looked healthier than most villagers. Their clothing appeared warm and clean. They carried parchments bearing official seals. Immediately, people gathered. Bad news often arrived on horseback. This occasion proved no exception. The officials announced that taxes would still be collected, reduced slightly, but collected nonetheless. A wave of disbelief moved through the crowd. Thomas exchanged a glance with Matthew. Neither spoke. What words could possibly improve the situation? Walter the steward read the decree aloud. The Lord required grain payments after the next harvest. The church required its share. The crown required its share. The familiar demands sounded almost absurd after months of starvation. Yet nobody openly challenged them. Fear remained powerful. After the officials departed, conversations erupted throughout the village. People complained quietly. Some cursed, others simply looked tired. Exhaustion had become more common than anger. That evening, Father Benedict attempted to calm tensions. He reminded villagers that planting season approached. The future depended upon cooperation. His message helped somewhat. Still, unease lingered. The famine had not merely emptied stomachs. It had weakened trust. Trust in authorities. Trust in promises. Trust that hard work guaranteed survival. Many assumptions no longer felt reliable. A week later, Thomas and Edwin began preparing their field. The soil remained damp but workable. They labored from sunrise until dusk. Every seed suddenly seemed precious. Every furrow carried enormous importance. The family possessed little margin for failure. Neither did anyone else. Throughout Ashmere, similar scenes unfolded. Villagers worked with quiet determination. Hope and fear walked side by side. Planting represented possibility, but also risk. Nobody knew whether weather would cooperate. Nobody knew whether another disaster waited ahead. Still, the seeds went into the ground because there was no alternative. One evening after finishing work, Thomas sat outside watching the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of gold and orange. For a moment, the countryside looked beautiful again, almost normal. Matthew joined him. The traveler had decided to remain in Ashmere rather than continue wandering. Several other newcomers made the same choice. A half-empty village offered more opportunity than a vanished one. The two men watched the horizon quietly. Then Matthew spoke. "Do you know what frightened me most during the famine?" Thomas expected him to mention hunger, or disease, or death. Instead, Matthew shook his head. It wasn't any of those. Thomas waited. Matthew looked toward the fields. It was how quickly people became accustomed to misery. The statement lingered between them. When everything first started, Matthew continued, every hardship felt shocking. He picked up a small stone. Then the shocking things became normal. Thomas understood immediately. The bark bread, the nettle soup, the boiled leather, the empty bakery, the constant funerals. Each had seemed impossible once, then ordinary. Matthew tossed the stone aside. That's what scared me. Neither man spoke afterward. The sun slipped below the horizon. Darkness settled across Ashmere, and for the first time in many months, Thomas allowed himself to imagine a future beyond famine. A dangerous hope, a fragile hope, yet a real one. Unfortunately, kingdom's troubles were not finished, because while villages struggled to recover, powerful men in distant halls were making decisions that would send grain prices soaring once again. And before the next harvest arrived, Ashmere would face a new crisis, one capable of turning hope back into desperation. Spring settled across the countryside, little by little, the trees surrounding Ashmere filled with fresh leaves. Birds returned to familiar nesting places. The river flowed more freely than it had in months. From a distance, the village almost appeared healthy again. A traveler passing through might have mistaken the scene for recovery. The fields had been planted. Children played outside more often. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys. Life seemed to be rebuilding itself. Yet appearances could be deceptive. The famine had loosened its grip, but it had not released it entirely. Thomas understood this every morning when he opened the family's food chest. There was never much inside. A few onions, some dried roots, a small sack containing the last scraps of winter provisions. Enough for now, not enough for comfort. Like most villagers, the family survived one day at a time. Everyone waited for the harvest. Everything depended upon it. One cloudy morning, nearly 6 weeks after the travelers arrived, disturbing news reached Ashmere. A merchant stopped briefly at the village square. His wagon carried cloth, tools, and several small sacks of grain. Immediately, people gathered around him. Food remained a subject of constant attention. The merchant exchanged greetings with Walter the steward, and then shared information gathered during his travels. The news spread through the village within hours. Grain prices had risen again, not slightly, dramatically. Thomas first heard the report while helping repair a fence near the church. A farmer named Hugh hurried toward him. "You heard?" Thomas looked up. "Heard what?" "The markets." Hugh shook his head. "Prices have climbed again." Thomas frowned. "How much?" Hugh named a figure. For several moments, Thomas thought he had misunderstood. The price seemed impossible, nearly double what it had been only months earlier. "That can't be right." "I wish it weren't." The farmer sighed heavily. "That's what the merchant said." The news darkened the mood throughout Ashmere. Many villagers had hoped that spring would gradually improve conditions. Instead, it seemed the kingdom remained trapped in crisis. Merchants blamed shortages. Landowners blamed poor harvests. Priests blamed misfortune. Nobody seemed capable of offering solutions. A few days later, another problem arrived. This one came on horseback. The same officials who had visited earlier returned to the village. Their appearance immediately caused unease. Nobody welcomed tax collectors, especially during a famine. The mounted men gathered the villagers near the square and announced new instructions from the Lord's estate. The manor required additional labor, road repairs, fence construction, storage building maintenance. The officials insisted these projects were were necessary. Perhaps they were, yet the timing felt cruel. The villagers already worked from dawn until dusk, tending their fields. Every hour mattered. Every day counted, removing laborers from planting and maintenance risked damaging future harvests. Still, refusal was not a realistic option. Thomas watched the crowd's reaction. Nobody shouted. Nobody protested openly. Years of feudal life had taught caution. Instead, people exchanged tired glances, the kind shared by individuals who recognized another burden approaching. That evening, the village felt unusually quiet. Margaret noticed it as well. Even the children seemed subdued. "The whole place feels different," she said. Thomas nodded. Everyone sensed it. The fragile optimism that spring had created was beginning to crack. The famine had already consumed so much. Now people feared losing whatever progress they had managed to achieve. The following weeks became exhausting. Thomas divided his time between his own field and the Lord's projects. Many mornings began before sunrise. Many evenings ended long after darkness arrived. The work itself was not unusual. Peasants labored constantly in every season. What made these weeks difficult was the uncertainty, the feeling that despite all effort, survival remained far from guaranteed. One afternoon, Thomas worked beside Matthew, repairing a damaged section of road. The traveler had adapted surprisingly well to village life. His strength had improved. His face no longer appeared quite so hollow, yet certain sadnesses remained visible. Some experiences never fully left a person. As they lifted stones into place, Matthew glanced toward the horizon. "You know what people are saying." Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead. "What now?" "Some merchants are storing grain." Thomas frowned. "Storing it?" Matthew nodded, waiting for prices to rise even further. The rumor spread rapidly after that. Whether entirely true or partially exaggerated hardly mattered. People believed it, and belief carried consequences. Villagers who already distrusted traders became even more suspicious. Every shortage began to feel deliberate. Every high price felt personal. The kingdom's hunger was creating more than starvation. It was creating resentment. Meanwhile, nature remained indifferent. The crops continued growing. Small green shoots expanded steadily across the fields. For the first time in many months, the land looked productive. Thomas often found himself staring at the young plants. They represented hope in its simplest form. Food not yet harvested. Food not yet eaten. Food not yet lost. Sometimes he imagined the coming autumn. Full granaries, fresh bread, warm meals, the return of ordinary life. Such thoughts helped him endure difficult days. Then came a setback, a minor one at first. Several weeks of unusually dry weather settled over the region. At first, nobody worried. After months of relentless rain, sunshine seemed welcome. Children enjoyed it. Farmers appreciated easier working conditions. The roads improved dramatically, but the dry weather continued and continued. Soon villagers began glancing toward the sky with growing concern. The soil hardened. Small cracks appeared in certain fields. The memory of previous failures remained fresh enough to make everyone nervous. Thomas inspected his crops each morning. Most looked healthy, yet he could not shake the feeling that disaster always waited nearby. One evening, Father Benedict addressed the village after prayer. The church remained crowded despite warmer weather. People still sought reassurance. The priest spoke calmly. "We have survived much already." His voice echoed against the stone walls. "We cannot allow fear of tomorrow to steal today's strength." The words sounded wise, yet many villagers struggled to follow them. Fear had become habitual. Months of hardship had trained people to expect bad news. Good fortune felt temporary. Disaster felt permanent. A few days later, another traveler arrived. Unlike previous visitors, this man carried written notices from larger towns. Walter read several aloud. Most concerned taxes, trade regulations, or regional matters. One announcement captured everyone's attention. Bandit activity had increased on several major roads. Merchants were hearing extra guards. Some routes had become dangerous. The news worried Thomas. Dangerous roads meant fewer supplies reaching markets. Fewer supplies meant higher prices. Higher prices meant more hardship. Everything connected to everything else. The famine's influence stretched far beyond empty fields. That night, while sitting outside the cottage, Thomas watched Edwin carving a small wooden figure. The boy had become quieter over the past year. Not unhappy, simply older in spirit than his age suggested. Many children across the kingdom experienced similar changes. Hunger taught lessons no childhood should require. "What are you making?" Thomas asked. Edwin held up the carving. "A bird." Thomas smiled. The figure looked crude, but recognizable. "Why a bird?" The boy thought for a moment. "Because they can leave." The answer surprised him. Thomas glanced toward the darkening sky. Birds, indeed, possessed freedoms unavailable to villagers. They crossed forests, rivers, kingdoms. They followed food and favorable weather. Peasants remained where they were born. For a moment, Thomas wondered how many adults secretly envied the same thing. Summer approached. The fields continued growing. The village endured. Life improved slightly compared to winter. Meals became larger thanks to fresh herbs and edible plants. Health slowly returned to some families. Yet nobody forgot the famine. Its shadow remained everywhere. Empty cottages, fresh graves, missing neighbors, stories whispered around evening fires. The crisis had shaped an entire generation. Then, during the first week of summer, an event occurred that nobody expected. A rider arrived from the Lord's manor, carrying urgent news. The man traveled hard. His horse appeared exhausted. Dust covered his cloak. The moment he entered Ashmere, villagers sensed trouble. Good news rarely arrived in such a hurry. Walter met him near the square. The two men spoke briefly. Then Walter's expression changed. People noticed immediately. Within minutes, a gathering formed. The steward climbed onto a wagon and cleared his throat. The crowd fell silent. Thomas stood beside Margaret and the children. Nearby, Matthew folded his arms. Father Benedict looked uneasy. Walter unrolled a parchment. His voice sounded strained. The Lord's northern granaries have been damaged by fire. A murmur swept through the crowd. Walter continued. Several storage buildings were destroyed. The murmuring grew louder. Everyone understood the implications. Grain lost, supplies reduced, prices affected, perhaps taxes increased, perhaps emergency collections demanded. Nobody knew yet, but everyone recognized another problem approaching. Months earlier, such news would have caused panic. Now it produced something different. Weariness, simple weariness. The villagers had spent so long enduring hardship that even disaster felt familiar. Still, Thomas felt a knot forming in his stomach, because he knew something many others knew as well. The kingdom remained balanced on a fragile edge. One failed harvest, one major fire, one disease outbreak, one poor decision. Any of them could push countless families back toward starvation. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, another rumor began circulating among the villagers. A rumor about missing grain shipments, about merchants growing wealthy while common people suffered, about warehouses hidden from public view. Most dismissed the stories at first, but within a few weeks, evidence would begin appearing, and Ashmere would find itself caught in a conflict far larger than famine alone. A struggle over food, profit, and survival that threatened to divide the kingdom itself. Summer settled over Ashmere with warm days, green fields, and a cautious sense of relief. For the first time in more than a year, the village no longer felt trapped beneath an endless season of misery. Children spent longer hours outdoors. The riverbanks filled with wildflowers. The forests seemed alive again. From a distance, the famine almost appeared to be fading into memory. Almost. Yet Thomas knew better. Everyone did. The fields looked promising, but the grain remained unharvested. The crops still belonged to the future, until the harvest stood safely inside granaries. Nobody could truly relax. A single storm could ruin everything. A disease could spread through the fields. An unexpected drought could undo months of labor. The village lived in a strange state between hope and caution. Then the rumors returned. This time, they arrived from multiple directions. Travelers spoke of them. Merchants denied them. Farmers discussed them quietly after church services. The story remained largely the same. Large quantities of grain were supposedly being hidden, stored away in private warehouses, kept from the markets, held back while prices continued rising. Thomas first heard the rumor, repeated by Hugh, while the two men worked near the eastern field. Hundreds of sacks, they say. Thomas looked up from his work. Hundreds, maybe more. Hugh wiped sweat from his brow. Some people claim entire barns are filled with grain. Thomas frowned. The idea seemed difficult to believe. The kingdom had suffered terrible shortages. How could anyone possess such reserves? Yet the rumor refused to disappear. Every week brought new versions. Some stories claimed wealthy merchants were responsible. Others blamed nobles. Still others accused distant monasteries. Nobody seemed certain. Everyone seemed suspicious. One evening, Matthew joined Thomas outside the cottage. The sun hung low over the fields. Golden light stretched across the growing grain. For several minutes, they sat quietly. Then Matthew spoke. "I've seen it happen before." Thomas glanced toward him. "What?" "People hiding food." Matthew picked up a twig and rolled it between his fingers. When prices rise, some men stop thinking about hunger. He snapped the twig in half. They start thinking about profit. Thomas remained silent. The statement felt uncomfortable because it sounded plausible. Over the next several weeks, tensions gradually increased. The market town, several hours away, became the center of countless rumors. Some merchants complained openly. Others hired additional guards. A few warehouses reportedly remained locked day and night. The more secrecy people observed, the more suspicious they became. Soon, ordinary conversations throughout Ashmere began changing. People no longer discussed only weather and crops. They discussed fairness, greed, responsibility, questions without easy answers. One afternoon, a peddler arrived carrying cloth, needles, and household tools. He also carried stories. Villagers gathered eagerly. News remained one of the few entertainments available. The peddler described unrest in several larger towns, arguments between merchants and citizens, crowds demanding lower prices, officials investigating missing grain shipments. Whether every detail proved true hardly mattered. The stories spread quickly. Each retelling added new details. Each new detail increased anxiety. That night, Thomas found himself unable to sleep. The cottage remained quiet. Margaret and the children rested nearby. Yet his thoughts wandered. He remembered winter, the bark bread, the nettle soup, the endless hunger, the fear, if food truly existed somewhere while people starved. What did that mean? The question lingered long after midnight. Days passed. Then something unusual happened. A wagon became stuck in mud near Ashmere. The vehicle belonged to a merchant traveling toward a larger city. Several villagers helped free it. Among them was Edwin. The boy returned home excited. "Father," he said, "the wagon was full of grain." Thomas smiled faintly. That hardly seemed surprising. Merchants transported grain constantly. Yet Edwin continued. It was covered. What do you mean? Covered with old cloth and empty barrels. Thomas paused. The detail caught his attention. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps it meant everything. Within hours, the story circulated through the village. The merchant claimed he feared bandits. Many accepted the explanation. Others did not. Every suspicious event now appeared connected to the larger rumors. Trust had become scarce, almost as scarce as food. Meanwhile, the fields continued growing. The grain looked healthy, better than anyone had dared hope during winter. Father Benedict encouraged optimism. The priest often walked among the crops, speaking with villagers. The harvest is coming, he reminded them. His words helped, but only partially. People wanted certainty. The world offered none. Then came the discovery. It happened in a town nearly 20 miles away. The news arrived through travelers. At first, few believed it. Then more witnesses appeared. The story remained remarkably consistent. Authorities had apparently uncovered a warehouse filled with grain. Not a small quantity, a massive reserve. Hundreds of sacks, perhaps more. The owner claimed he intended to sell them eventually. Many people doubted him. The revelation spread through the region like wildfire. Markets erupted with arguments. Citizens demanded investigations. Officials promised action. Merchants protested their innocence. Everyone blamed someone else. Ashmere felt the effects immediately. Conversations grew sharper. Old frustrations resurfaced. Months of suffering suddenly seemed harder to accept. One evening, a heated discussion broke out near the village well. Several men argued about responsibility. Who deserved blame? The merchants, the nobles, the king's officials, the weather. The arguments lasted nearly an hour. Father Benedict eventually intervened, not because violence threatened, because anger itself seemed dangerous. The famine had already taken enough. Nobody wanted resentment to become the next disaster. Thomas listened carefully during these conversations. He understood both sides. Merchants required profit. Without profit, trade collapsed. Yet hunger changed perspectives. A starving family rarely worried about economic principles. They worried about tomorrow's meal. As summer deepened, another challenge emerged. Not famine, not disease. Fatigue, a different kind of exhaustion, settled across the village. People had spent nearly 2 years living under constant pressure. Every season brought new worries. Every month delivered another crisis. Even hopeful news felt difficult to trust. The emotional weight accumulated. Thomas noticed it in himself. He still worked, still planned, still hoped, yet some part of him remained cautious, as though happiness itself might attract disaster. One afternoon, he found Eleanor sitting outside beneath a tree. The old woman watched the fields quietly. "You're thinking," Thomas said. She smiled faintly. "I usually am." He sat beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Eleanor gestured toward the grain. "When I was young, I thought famines were about food." Thomas listened. "Now I know they're about time." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The old woman studied the horizon. "Hunger lasts longer than empty stomachs." Thomas considered her words. She continued, "The harvest will come." Her voice remained calm. "But people will remember." The statement proved remarkably accurate, because throughout Ashmere, memories had become part of daily life. Children remembered cold nights and tiny meals. Parents remembered difficult choices. Travelers remembered abandoned villages. Nobody emerged unchanged. Then finally, the harvest season approached. Golden grain replaced green stalks. Fields swayed beneath warm breezes. The sight lifted spirits throughout the village. People smiled more frequently. Laughter returned occasionally. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in many months. Preparations began immediately. Tools were repaired. Storage spaces cleaned. Plans organized. Everything pointed toward a successful harvest. Then disaster nearly struck. 3 days before harvesting began, dark clouds gathered along the western horizon. Massive clouds, the kind farmers feared. Thomas noticed them first while working near the field. By evening, the entire village watched the sky. Thunder rolled in the distance. Lightning flashed beyond the hills. A storm approached. Not an ordinary storm. A violent one. The timing could not have been worse. Heavy rain might flatten crops. Strong winds could destroy entire sections of grain. Months of effort suddenly seemed vulnerable. That night, almost nobody slept. Villagers listened to the approaching thunder. Parents whispered prayers. Farmers stared into darkness. The storm reached Ashmere shortly after midnight. Rain hammered rooftops. Wind howled between cottages. Trees bent and groaned. For hours, the village endured the fury. Thomas lay awake listening. Every gust felt like a threat. Every crash of thunder sounded catastrophic. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had passed. The village emerged cautiously. People hurried toward the fields. Thomas joined them. His heart pounded as he crossed the muddy ground. The damage was real, but not catastrophic. Several sections of grain had fallen. A few trees lay broken. Some fences required repair. Yet the harvest survived. A collective sense of relief spread across Ashmere. For the first time in nearly 2 years, fortune had chosen mercy. The villagers immediately began harvesting. Everyone worked. Men, women, children, travelers, neighbors. The entire community moved with determination because they understood exactly what stood before them. Not merely grain, security, survival, the possibility of normal life returning. But as the first wagon loads of harvested grain rolled toward storage. Another rider appeared on the road from the manor, and judging by the urgency of his arrival, he carried news that threatened to cast a shadow over the village's long-awaited success, a shadow connected not to weather or famine, but to taxes and the Lord's growing demands. The rider reached Ashmere before noon. His horse was covered in sweat despite the mild weather. Dust clung to his boots and cloak. The moment villagers noticed the manor's colors stitched onto his clothing, conversations slowed. A familiar feeling spread through the harvest fields. Unease. The grain stood ready. The harvest had begun. People should have been celebrating. Instead, they watched the rider approach Walter the steward near the village square. The two men exchanged a few words. Walter's expression tightened immediately. That alone told everyone enough. Bad news had arrived. Work continued, but not with the same energy. Eyes drifted repeatedly toward the square. Whispers moved between workers. Eventually, Walter climbed onto a wagon and called for attention. One by one, villagers gathered. Thomas arrived with Edwin and Matthew. Margaret joined them a few moments later. Around them stood dozens of tired faces, weathered by 2 difficult years. Walter unrolled a parchment. The silence felt heavy. The Lord has issued new harvest requirements. A murmur spread instantly. Nobody liked the sound of that. Walter continued reading. The manor expected a larger share of grain than originally planned. The official explanation referenced losses caused by the granary fire months earlier. Repairs were expensive. Reserves needed rebuilding. The Lord's household required supplies. Therefore, additional collections would be necessary. As Walter spoke, Thomas noticed the expressions around him changing. Not shock, not surprise, something else. Exhaustion, pure exhaustion. The villagers had survived flooding, crop failure, disease, starvation. They had endured bark bread and nettle soup. They had buried neighbors. They had waded through endless uncertainty. Now, just as hope finally appeared within reach, another demand arrived. When Walter finished reading, nobody cheered. Nobody applauded. Nobody even argued. The crowd simply stood there, quiet. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then people gradually returned to work, not because they accepted the decision, because there was little alternative. That evening, the mood throughout Ashmere felt noticeably different. The harvest continued successfully. The grain was good. The yield exceeded expectations. Yet celebration remained absent. People calculated, measured, estimated how much would remain after taxes, how much could be stored. Would families possess enough to survive winter? The questions followed everyone. Thomas sat at the table that night studying a small collection of grain samples. Edwin watched him. So we have food now. Thomas smiled faintly. We have food growing into food. The boy frowned. What does that mean? It means we aren't safe. until it's stored. Eleanor nodded from her seat near the hearth. Wisdom often arrives after hardship. Nobody argued. The old woman had earned the right to speak such truths. Over the following days, harvesting intensified. The entire village worked from dawn until darkness. Fields gradually transformed. Golden grain disappeared into wagons. Wagons disappeared into storage barns. Each completed load brought satisfaction. Yet beneath that satisfaction remained anxiety. One afternoon, Thomas worked beside Hugh near the western field. The farmer looked healthier than he had during winter. Still, shadows lingered beneath his eyes. "Do you know what bothers me most?" Hugh asked. Thomas adjusted a bundle of grain. "What?" Hugh looked across the field. "We finally have food." Thomas nodded. "And I'm still worried." The statement captured the mood perfectly. Food existed once again, yet fear remained. Months of scarcity had changed people. Abundance felt fragile, temporary, something to protect rather than enjoy. Several days later, the first tax collections began. Manor officials arrived with carts and records. Villagers lined up beside storage areas. One by one, measured portions of grain were removed. The process remained orderly, professional, routine, that almost made it worse. The grain represented months of labor. Families watched as portions disappeared into wagons destined for distant storage buildings. Nobody caused trouble. Nobody resisted. Still, the atmosphere felt strained. Thomas noticed Margaret watching one collection closely. Her expression revealed nothing, yet he understood her thoughts. Every sack carried memories. The flooded fields, the hunger, the winter, the waiting. Loss always feels greater when attached to effort. Meanwhile, the rumors concerning hidden grain reserves continued spreading across the kingdom. Travelers brought updates regularly. Some merchants had reportedly been investigated. Several warehouses had been inspected. Arguments continued in larger towns. The stories fascinated villagers, not because they loved gossip, because the rumors offered explanations. People desperately wanted explanations. Disasters caused by weather felt random. Disasters caused by human choices felt personal. One evening, Matthew discussed the issue with Thomas while they repaired a damaged fence. "The strange thing," Matthew said, "is that everyone wants a villain." Thomas considered this. "A villain?" Matthew nodded. "Someone to blame for everything." The traveler paused. "Sometimes there is one, and sometimes," Matthew shrugged, "sometimes bad weather is simply bad weather." The observation lingered in Thomas's thoughts. People preferred simple stories. Heroes, villains, clear causes. Reality often proved less satisfying. As autumn progressed, Ashmere slowly stabilized. The food chest inside Thomas's cottage no longer looked empty. Fresh grain occupied storage bins. Bread returned to regular meals. Stews became thicker. The difference felt remarkable. Alice's cheeks regained color. Edwin appeared stronger. Even Margaret laughed more often. Small changes, yet meaningful ones. The village experienced similar improvements. Children played more energetically. Neighbors shared meals again. Smoke rising from chimneys carried familiar smells. The sense of actual cooking rather than survival. For the first time in years, Ashmere began feeling like a village instead of a collection of struggling households. Then came the feast of St. Michael. Under ordinary circumstances, the celebration would have been modest. This year, it felt extraordinary. The church bells rang. Villagers gathered. Tables appeared in the square. Food remained simple. Bread, vegetables, a little cheese, a small amount of meat. Nothing lavish, yet compared to the previous winter, it seemed magnificent. Thomas watched as children chased one another through the square. Their laughter echoed between cottages. For a moment, he realized something important. The famine had stolen many things, but it had not taken everything. Community remained. Friendship remained. Hope remained. Those things mattered. That night, Father Benedict addressed the gathering. The priest looked older than he had 2 years earlier. Everyone did. Still, his voice remained steady. We survived. The words produced quiet agreement. Not celebration. Recognition. Simple recognition. We mourned those who were lost. The priest lowered his head briefly. We remember difficult days. Several villagers nodded. Some stared at the ground. The memories remained vivid. But we also give thanks. The church bells sounded once more. The evening continued beneath lantern light and autumn stars. For a few precious hours, Ashmere felt peaceful. Months passed. Autumn gradually yielded to winter. This time, the season arrived differently. Not as an enemy, not as a threat, simply as winter. The distinction mattered. Food existed in storage. Firewood had been gathered. Preparations were complete. The fear that had dominated the previous year remained absent. Not entirely gone, but diminished. One snowy evening, Thomas sat beside the hearth watching flames dance across the logs. The cottage felt warm, comfortable, safe, a feeling he had almost forgotten. Margaret mended clothing. Alice slept. Edwin carved another wooden bird. Eleanor rested quietly. Outside, snow drifted through the darkness. Inside, the family shared fresh bread. Real bread. Not bark bread. Not acorn bread. Not desperation shaped into a loaf. Actual bread, made from grain grown in their own field. Thomas tore off a piece and smiled. The taste seemed almost miraculous. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was ordinary. During famine, ordinary things become treasures. Later that night, after everyone else had fallen asleep, Thomas remained awake. The fire burned low. The cottage sat silent. His thoughts wandered back through the previous 2 years. The endless rain, the empty bakery, the moss stew, the travelers, the graves, the fear. So many moments had felt unbearable while they occurred. Yet somehow life continued. Human beings possessed a stubborn ability to continue. Perhaps that was the true lesson of famine. Not merely what people ate, not merely how they survived, but how they endured uncertainty itself. Years later, children born after the famine would hear stories. Stories about bark flour, boiled leather, nettle soup, bean husks, roots, moss. Many would struggle to believe them, just as Thomas once struggled to believe similar tales from Eleanor's childhood. That is the nature of difficult history. Once hardship passes, it begins to sound impossible. Yet it happened, and because it happened, people remembered. The famine eventually became a story, then a memory, then a lesson passed from one generation to the next. A reminder that prosperity should never be taken for granted. A reminder that ordinary bread can be extraordinary. A reminder that survival often depends upon neighbors as much as food. And on cold winter evenings, long after the fields recovered and the granaries filled once more, the people of Ashmere would still tell stories about the hungry years, stories of what medieval people ate during famine, stories of what they sacrificed, stories of what they learned, and perhaps most importantly, stories of how they endured. Winter passed more gently than anyone in Ashmere could remember. The snow still fell. The winds still howled across the fields. The night still seemed endless. Yet everything felt different. For the first time in years, people entered winter with food stored safely in barns and cottages. Nobody measured every crumb. Nobody counted every spoonful of porridge. Nobody stared anxiously into empty cupboards, wondering how many meals remained. The famine was over. At least that was what people said. Thomas sometimes wondered whether that was entirely true. One cold morning near the end of winter, he walked through the village, carrying a sack of grain toward the mill. The road looked familiar. The cottages looked familiar. The church bell sounded familiar. Yet something had changed. The village was smaller, not physically, but in another way. Many faces were gone. Some cottages remained empty. Some doors never opened. Some gardens were no longer tended. The famine had ended, but the people it claimed would never return. As he passed the abandoned cottage that once belonged to the Cooper's family, Thomas slowed. Snow rested quietly upon the roof. No smoke rose from the chimney. No footprints marked the doorway. Nature seemed eager to erase the memory of those who had lived there. Thomas stood for a moment before continuing. He was not the only one who noticed such things. All across Ashmere, reminders remained. A vacant chair during gatherings, a missing voice during church services, an empty place at the harvest feast. Loss had become part of the landscape. Spring arrived once again. This time, the villagers welcomed it without fear. The fields were planted confidently. The weather remained favorable. The river behaved itself. No endless rains arrived. No disasters emerged from the horizon. For months, life proceeded almost normally. Almost. One evening, while sitting beside the hearth, Edwin asked a question that surprised everyone. "Father, were things always like that?" Thomas looked up. "Like what?" "The famine." Thomas shook his head. "No." Edwin frowned. "Then why does everyone talk about it so much?" The boy was older now, taller, stronger. The hunger that once hollowed his face had disappeared. Yet he carried memories that children should never have possessed. Thomas considered the question carefully. Before he could answer, Eleanor spoke from her chair. "Because people fear forgetting." The room grew quiet. The old woman stared into the flames. When difficult times pass, people begin believing they can never return. Edwin listened attentively. "They can return." Eleanor nodded slowly. "They always can." The words lingered long after the conversation ended. Throughout the kingdom, similar lessons were being remembered and forgotten. The markets recovered. Trade increased. Merchants traveled more frequently. Roads became busy once again. People preferred discussing prosperity rather than hunger. Such topics felt more pleasant. Yet a few individuals paid close attention to the signs around them. Among them was Father Benedict. The priest had changed during the famine. He spoke differently now, less about certainty, more about preparation. One Sunday after service, he addressed the congregation. "Store what you can." Some villagers looked puzzled. The harvest had been good. The future appeared promising. "Why worry?" Father Benedict continued. "Not because disaster is coming." He smiled faintly. "But because disaster never announces itself when it does." The advice spread throughout Ashmere. Families began storing modest reserves. Nothing excessive, nothing selfish, simply enough to provide security. Thomas approved. Experience had taught him the value of preparation. A year later, another good harvest arrived. Then another. Gradually, the famine receded into memory. Children born afterward knew it only through stories. Stories that sounded increasingly unbelievable. One summer afternoon, Alice, now nearly grown, sat beside the river with several younger children. They asked endless questions. Did people really eat bark? Did they really boil leather? Did anyone actually make soup from nettles? Alice laughed softly. The questions sounded absurd, yet she remembered. "I saw all of it." The younger children stared in fascination. To them, the famine belonged to the same category as legends. Ancient battles, dragons, saints performing miracles, events difficult to imagine. Alice understood why. The countryside looked healthy now. The fields overflowed with grain. Fruit trees bent beneath their harvest. Birds filled the skies. Nothing suggested that starvation had once stalked these lands. Nothing except memory. Meanwhile, larger changes unfolded throughout the kingdom. The famine had forced many nobles to reconsider how they managed their estates. Some ignored the lessons entirely. Others adapted. Additional granaries were constructed. Certain monasteries increased their food reserves. Several towns improved storage systems. People hoped such measures might prevent future suffering. Whether they would succeed remained uncertain. Human beings often learn lessons during hardship. The challenge lies in remembering those lessons once comfort returns. Years continued passing. Thomas's hair gradually turned gray. Edwin became a man. Alice eventually married a carpenter from a neighboring village. New children filled Ashmere's roads and fields. Life moved forward, as it always does. Then, nearly 15 years after the famine ended, a traveler arrived carrying an old story. The man was elderly, his face weathered by decades of journeys. One evening, he sat near the inn sharing tales from distant regions. Villagers gathered eagerly. Travelers remained valuable sources of entertainment. The old man spoke about wars, kings, markets, storms. Then he mentioned a famine that had occurred when he was a child, a famine older than the one Ashmere remembered. The details sounded strangely familiar. Failed harvests, high prices, desperate meals, empty villages. When he finished, Edwin approached him. How long ago was that? The traveler thought for a moment. Nearly 60 years. Edwin nodded, and people still talk about it. The old man smiled. Oh yes. He stared into the fire. People remember hunger for a very long time. That night, Edwin thought about those words. The next day, he shared them with Thomas. Together, they walked through the fields, discussing the past. The grain swayed gently beneath the summer breeze. Healthy, abundant, beautiful. Thomas looked across the landscape. When I was your age, he said, I thought history was about kings. Edwin smiled. And now, Thomas considered the question. Now I think history is about ordinary people surviving ordinary disasters. The answer felt right. Most lives passed unnoticed by chroniclers. Most struggles never appeared in books. Yet they mattered. The people of Ashmere would never become famous. No songs would celebrate them. No monuments would honor them. Still, they endured one of the hardest periods of their lives. And they survived. Perhaps that was enough. Years later, after Thomas himself had become one of the village elders, he occasionally sat beneath the same tree where Eleanor once rested. Children gathered around him, asking questions. Many wanted to hear stories about the famine. The bark bread fascinated them most, the leather least. The moss stew often made them laugh. Thomas never minded repeating the stories, because each telling preserved something important, not the suffering itself, the lesson, the understanding that comfort should be appreciated, that food should not be wasted, that neighbors matter, that preparation matters, and that ordinary people possess remarkable strength when circumstances demand it. As the years rolled onward, the famine gradually transformed. First it became memory, then history, then legend. Yet even after decades had passed, elderly villagers still lowered their voices when discussing the hungry years. They still remembered the empty bakery, the silent roads, the endless rain, the strange meals, the uncertainty. Most of all, they remembered the feeling of not knowing whether tomorrow would bring enough food. That feeling never vanished completely. Perhaps it never could. And so the story of Ashmere continued, carried from one generation to the next, not as a tale of kings or battles, but as a reminder of what ordinary medieval people endured when the harvests failed and survival itself became their greatest achievement. Many years passed. The children who had once listened, wide-eyed to stories of bark bread and nettle soup, became adults. The adults who had survived the famine became elders, and some of the elders became names carved into weathered stones beside the church. Time moved quietly through Ashmere. Seasons came and went. Harvests succeeded. Occasionally they disappointed, but none brought the terror of the hungry years. At least not yet. The village changed slowly. New cottages appeared. Old roofs were replaced. The road leading toward the market town improved. A larger mill was built beside the river. Prosperity never arrived in great abundance, but stability did. For many people, that felt almost as valuable. Edwin was now a grown man, with children of his own. His oldest son, William, had reached 14 years of age. At 14, William possessed the confidence common to boys who had never experienced true hardship. He had heard stories of the famine countless times. He simply struggled to imagine them. One summer evening, he sat beside his father outside their cottage. The fields glowed golden beneath the setting sun. "It couldn't have been that bad," William said. Edwin smiled faintly. "What couldn't?" "The famine." Edwin looked toward the horizon. There was no anger in his expression, no annoyance, only patience. "Why do you think that?" William shrugged. "People survived." For a moment, Edwin said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes." The boy waited. "That's exactly why you think it wasn't that bad." William frowned. Edwin pointed toward the fields. "If a storm destroys half the harvest, people remember the missing grain." He paused. "If a famine destroys half a village, people only see the half that survived." The boy considered this carefully. The conversation remained with him long afterward. Throughout Ashmere, similar exchanges occurred. The famine belonged increasingly to history. Young people viewed it as a distant event. Old people viewed it as yesterday. That difference shaped how each generation understood the world. Then came the spring that made the elders uneasy. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Winter ended normally. The snow melted. The river rose slightly. Planting began. Everything appeared familiar. Then the rain arrived. A week passed. Then another. Then another. The rain continued. Not violent storms. Not dramatic floods. Simply endless rain. Day after day. Week after week. The sky remained gray. The fields remained wet. The roads dissolved into mud. The younger villagers complained about inconvenience. The older villagers became quiet. Very quiet. Edwin noticed it first during a gathering outside the church. The younger farmers joked about needing boats instead of carts. Nobody among the elders laughed. Several exchanged worried glances, the same glances Thomas had once exchanged with others decades earlier. One evening, William found his father standing beside the eastern field. Rain dripped steadily from his cloak. The soil beneath their feet squelched with every step. "What are you looking at?" William asked. Edwin stared across the waterlogged ground. "The same thing my father looked at once." The boy followed his gaze. "I don't understand." Edwin pointed toward several sections of the field. Seeds should have been sprouting there. Instead, puddles covered the earth. The boy's expression changed slightly. "You think something's wrong." Edwin remained silent for several moments. Finally, he answered, "I think I've seen this before." Word spread gradually. The older generation grew concerned. The younger generation remained skeptical. After all, a few weeks of rain did not guarantee disaster. The kingdom had experienced wet seasons before. Most passed without serious consequences. Yet memory can be a powerful thing. Those who remembered the famine found themselves noticing every detail, every flooded ditch, every drowned patch of crops, every dark cloud gathering on the horizon. Thomas was now an old man. His hair had turned completely white. His movements had slowed considerably, yet his mind remained sharp. One rainy afternoon, William visited him. The old man sat beneath the cottage roof watching water fall from the sky. "Father says he's worried." Thomas nodded. "Your father is wise." William sat beside him. "Do you think another famine is coming?" The old man looked toward the fields. Rain tapped steadily against the roof. For a while he said nothing. Then he smiled slightly. "No." William looked relieved. Thomas raised a finger. "But neither do. I think one is impossible." The boy frowned. The answer seemed unsatisfying. Thomas chuckled softly. "When you're young, you want certainty." He watched the rain. "When you're old, you learn how little certainty exists." The weeks continued passing. The rain continued falling. Market travelers began bringing reports from other regions. Some areas experienced similar weather. Others did not. The information provided little comfort. Nobody yet knew whether the problem was local or widespread. Then the first troubling reports arrived. Several farmers noticed seeds failing to sprout properly. A few low fields became unusable. Small losses, nothing catastrophic, yet enough to attract attention. The conversations around Ashmere changed. People began discussing whether more frequently. They began checking fields more often. They began remembering stories they had not spoken about in years. One evening, the church hosted a gathering, not because disaster had arrived, because anxiety had. Father Benedict had long since passed away. A younger priest now served the village, yet the purpose remained similar. People sought reassurance. The priest spoke calmly. We should not fear every cloud. Several villagers nodded. The advice sounded reasonable. Still, afterward, many remained discussing conditions outside the church. Old memories had been awakened. They refused to return quietly to sleep. As summer approached, the rain finally weakened. Sunlight appeared more frequently. The fields began recovering. Relief spread through the village. Perhaps the elders had worried unnecessarily. Perhaps history was not repeating itself. Perhaps everything would be fine. William certainly believed so. One afternoon, he found Edwin examining the crops. They're growing, the young man said proudly. Edwin nodded. Yes, we worried for nothing. The older man smiled. No, William looked confused. Edwin rested a hand on his shoulder. Worrying isn't always about predicting disaster. He glanced across the field. Sometimes it's about remembering what disaster looks like. The harvest that year proved average. Not excellent, not terrible, perfectly ordinary. The village celebrated. The younger generation felt vindicated. The older generation felt grateful. Everyone moved forward. Yet something subtle had changed. The brief period of heavy rain reminded Ashmere of an important truth. The famine had ended. The possibility of famine had not. Nature remained unpredictable. The future remained uncertain. No amount of prosperity could entirely remove those realities. Several months later, during a cold autumn evening, Thomas sat beside the hearth, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The children begged for stories, as they always did. One little girl pointed toward a loaf of fresh bread resting on the table. Tell us about the bark bread. The room filled with laughter. Thomas laughed as well. Then he began. Outside, the wind moved through the village. Inside, memories moved through generations. Stories once born from suffering had become lessons. Lessons had become traditions. And traditions had become part of Ashmere itself. The old man spoke slowly. The children listened carefully. None of them realized that they were receiving something far more valuable than a story. They were receiving memory, the kind of memory that helps communities survive long after those who first experienced hardship are gone. And as the fire crackled softly beside them, Thomas understood something he had not fully realized before. The famine's greatest legacy was not the hunger, not the bark bread, not the nettle soup, not even the suffering. Its greatest legacy was the determination to remember, because forgotten lessons have a way of returning, and remembered lessons have a way of protecting those who come after. The years continued their quiet march across Ashmere. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Fields were planted and harvested so many times that individual seasons blurred together. New cottages appeared where empty ground once stood. Old cottages vanished as wood decayed and generations passed. The village changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, as villages often do. Yet one change could not be ignored. Thomas was growing old, very old. His back curved slightly now. His hands trembled occasionally when lifting heavy objects. The long walks he once enjoyed became shorter each year. Even so, he remained a familiar sight throughout Ashmere. Children waved when they passed him. Farmers stopped to exchange greetings. Travelers often heard his name before they met him. Many younger villagers knew him less as a farmer and more as a keeper of stories. The stories of the hungry years. The stories of survival. The stories of things most people hoped never to witness again. One autumn afternoon, Thomas sat beneath the large oak tree near the church. The tree had stood there longer than anyone could remember. Generations had rested beneath its branches. The old man watched villagers carrying grain from the fields. The harvest had been good, not remarkable, simply good, and after everything he had experienced, good seemed more than enough. William joined him, though no longer a boy. He still occasionally sought his grandfather's company. The two sat together quietly for a while. Then William spoke. The children don't believe half the stories anymore. Thomas smiled. That's probably a good sign. William laughed softly. They think bark bread sounds impossible. Thomas looked toward the village. When life improves, hardship always sounds impossible. He paused, and then one day people discover it wasn't. The younger man nodded thoughtfully. The conversation drifted toward memories. Old neighbors, past harvests, long-forgotten events. Eventually, William asked a question that surprised Thomas. What should we do when you're gone? The old man turned toward him. William looked slightly embarrassed. I mean the stories. Thomas remained silent for several moments. A cool breeze moved through the oak leaves overhead. Finally, he answered. Tell them. William smiled. That's all. Thomas nodded. That's all. The answer seemed almost too simple. Yet the more William considered it, the more sensible it became. Stories survive only when someone chooses to tell them. That winter proved particularly peaceful. Snow covered the fields. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Families gathered around warm hearths. The village felt secure, safe, comfortable, the sort of winter people once dreamed about during the famine. One evening, shortly after the first snowfall, the priest announced a special gathering. The entire village was invited. Curious residents filled the church, young and old, farmers and craftsmen, families carrying small children. Everyone wondered what required such attention. The priest stood before them. Beside him rested several wooden boxes. After greetings and prayers, he explained, "We are creating a village record." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A village record was unusual, not unheard of, but unusual. The priest continued, "Too many memories disappear when people do." Several villagers nodded. That much was certainly true. The famine generation had already begun shrinking. Each year more voices were lost. More stories faded. The priest gestured toward the boxes. "We will collect accounts." People exchanged curious glances. "Accounts of what?" someone asked. "Everything." The priest smiled. Harvests, storms, weddings, births, difficult years, prosperous years. His expression softened. And the famine. The church grew quiet. Even after all these years, the word carried weight. The project began immediately. Over the following months, villagers shared memories. Some contributed brief stories. Others offered detailed recollections. The priest carefully recorded everything. Thomas became one of the most important contributors. Several evenings, each week, he sat beside candlelight answering questions. How much rain had fallen? What foods had people eaten? How had the village survived? What mistakes had been made? What lessons had been learned? The old man answered patiently. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he fell silent. Some memories remained difficult even after decades. One night, while describing the winter of the famine, he paused unexpectedly. The priest looked up. "Are you tired?" Thomas stared at the candle flame. "No." His voice remained soft. "I was remembering faces." The priest waited. People always remember events. Thomas smiled sadly. They remember floods, storms, empty fields. He lowered his eyes. But what disappears first are the faces. The room remained silent. The observation lingered long after the conversation ended. Spring arrived again. Another planting season began. Another cycle continued. Yet those working on the village record noticed something remarkable. The younger generation listened, truly listened. Children who once laughed at stories about bark bread now asked questions, detailed questions, thoughtful questions, not because they feared famine, because they wanted to understand. The stories were becoming history, and history possesses a strange power. It allows people to experience events they never lived through. One afternoon, a group of children gathered around Thomas outside his cottage. The old man sat in a chair, enjoying the sunshine. A little boy pointed toward a loaf of bread cooling nearby. Was bread really that important? The question made several adults laugh. Thomas smiled. Then he picked up the loaf. The crust crackled softly. The smell drifted through the air. He handed it to the boy. "Take a bite." The child did. "It tastes good." Thomas nodded. "Now imagine not having it." The boy considered this. Then he shook his head. "I don't want to." The old man smiled gently. "Neither did we." Years continued passing. The village record slowly filled. Page after page. Story after story. Memory after memory. It became something more than a collection of events. It became a bridge, a connection between generations, a reminder that the present had been shaped by the past. Meanwhile, Thomas grew weaker. Nobody spoke about it openly. Nobody needed to. The signs were visible. He spent more time resting, less time walking, more time remembering, less time working. One summer evening, he asked William to accompany him to the eastern field, the same field that had once flooded during the first year of famine. The grain stood tall now, golden beneath the setting sun. The two men walked slowly. Eventually, they stopped near the center of the field. Thomas looked across the landscape. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he smiled. "It looks different." William followed his gaze. "It looks the same to me." Thomas chuckled softly. "That's because you never saw it drowned." The younger man understood. The field carried different meanings for each generation. To some, it was simply land. To others, it was memory. They remained there until sunset painted the sky orange and gold. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Promise me something." William nodded. "What is it?" "Don't let them remember only the suffering." The answer surprised him. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked toward the village. "People think the famine story is about hunger." He shook his head gently. "It isn't." William waited. "It's about survival." The old man smiled. "It's about neighbors sharing what little they had." He pointed toward distant cottages. "It's about people continuing when continuing seemed impossible." The wind moved through the grain. Soft waves rolled across the field. Thomas watched them carefully. Then he added one final thought. "And it's about ordinary bread becoming extraordinary." William never forgot those words. Months later, when the first copies of the village record were completed, one section received a special title. Not the Great Famine, not the years of hunger. Instead, the priest chose a simpler name. The years we endured. The title felt right, because that was what the story had always been. Not merely a story about starvation, a story about endurance. And as Ashmere prepared to enter another peaceful autumn, the old village understood that memory itself could be a form of protection, a warning, a lesson, a gift, one generation passing wisdom to the next, so that if difficult years ever returned, those who faced them would not begin entirely unprepared. They would remember, and sometimes remembering is the first step toward surviving. Winter arrived quietly during Thomas's final year. No great storms announced its coming. No fierce winds swept across the countryside. Instead, snow settled gently upon the rooftops of Ashmere, covering the village in a blanket of white that seemed almost peaceful. The fields rested beneath frost. The river moved slowly. Smoke drifted from chimneys into pale gray skies. For most villagers, it was simply another winter. For those closest to Thomas, it felt different. The old man rarely left his cottage now. His walks had become short. His strength had faded noticeably. Even climbing from his chair required effort. Yet his mind remained as clear as ever. That fact alone brought comfort to many. People still visited regularly. Neighbors stopped by with bread. Children arrived to hear stories. Farmers came seeking advice. Travelers occasionally requested meetings with the man whose memories had become part of village history. Thomas welcomed them all. He knew time was becoming precious. One snowy afternoon, a group of children gathered beside his hearth. The youngest among them could barely remember a world before the village record existed. To them, the stories of famine belonged to history, almost legend. One little girl pointed toward the fire. "Tell us about the bark bread again." Several adults nearby smiled. They had heard the story dozens of times, perhaps hundreds. Thomas laughed softly. "You children always ask for that one." The girl nodded eagerly. "It's my favorite." Thomas shook his head in amusement. "I cannot imagine why." Yet he began anyway. As always, the children listened carefully. They listened to descriptions of endless rain, of flooded fields, of empty cupboards, of strange meals created from desperation. But something had changed over the years. The children no longer seemed fascinated by the hunger itself. Instead, they seemed fascinated by the people, the choices they made, the courage they showed, the ways they helped one another. Thomas noticed that, and it pleased him, because that was what he had always hoped people would remember. Not merely suffering, but resilience. As winter deepened, more villagers found reasons to visit. Some brought gifts, others simply came to sit and talk. Nobody said what everyone already understood. Nobody spoke openly about farewells. Yet the feeling lingered in every conversation. One evening, Father Adrian, the current priest, stopped by carrying a newly copied section of the village record. He placed it carefully upon the table. "The latest pages are finished." Thomas examined the manuscript. The handwriting was neat. The pages were clean. The memories preserved. There would likely outlive everyone currently alive. The thought comforted him. Father Adrian sat quietly for a while. Eventually, he asked a question. "Do you regret anything?" Thomas considered the matter carefully. Outside, snow drifted past the window. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Finally, he answered, "Of course." The priest waited. There are always things a person wishes they had done differently. His gaze settled on the flames. But I learned something. What? Thomas smiled. Most regrets become smaller if you live long enough. The priest thought about that for a while. The answer felt strangely wise. As weeks passed, Thomas spent more time remembering. Not just the famine. Everything. His childhood. His parents. His first years working the fields. Meeting Margaret. Raising Edwin and Alice. The difficult winters. The good harvests. The countless ordinary days that had quietly built an entire life. Those memories arrived unexpectedly, sometimes while watching snowfall, sometimes while listening to distant church bells, sometimes while holding a piece of fresh bread. The bread always made him smile, no matter how many years passed. He never forgot what it felt like to lack it. One morning, shortly after sunrise, William found him sitting near the window. The old man appeared thoughtful. "What are you looking at?" Thomas pointed toward the village square. Children played in the snow. Their laughter carried faintly through the cold air. "They don't know." William followed his gaze. "They don't know what?" Thomas smiled. "How lucky they are." The younger man laughed softly. "Nobody ever knows that while it's happening." Thomas nodded. "Exactly." The answer lingered between them. Days later, the entire village gathered for the annual winter feast. The celebration remained modest. Nothing extravagant. Just neighbors sharing food and companionship during the coldest season. This year, however, one addition had been planned. A surprise. Near the end of the evening, Father Adrian stood before the crowd. Beside him rested a wooden box. The villagers fell silent. The priest opened the box carefully. Inside lay the completed village record, bound securely, protected against age and weather. Decades of memories filled its pages. The priest lifted the volume. "This belongs to all of us." His voice echoed through the hall. "But there is one person without whom much of it would not exist." Many heads turned immediately. Thomas looked mildly embarrassed. The priest smiled. "We cannot preserve the past unless someone remembers it." The villagers began applauding. The sound filled the room. Not loud, not dramatic, warm, genuine, the sort of applause reserved for gratitude rather than celebration. Thomas lowered his head slightly. For a moment, he seemed overwhelmed, not by pride, by appreciation. After the gathering ended, people remained talking late into the evening. Children played. Neighbors shared stories. Laughter echoed through the hall. Thomas watched quietly, perhaps more quietly than usual. At one point, Margaret's old chair was mentioned. Then Eleanor. Then Father Benedict. Then Bertram, and others lost during the famine. One memory led naturally to another. The past felt strangely present that night. Not sad, present, like old friends visiting for an evening. Eventually, the hall emptied. Snow covered the roads outside. Lanterns flickered in cottage windows. Ashmere settled into sleep. Before leaving, William paused beside Thomas. "Did you enjoy tonight?" The old man smiled. "Very much." He looked around the now empty hall, then added softly, "It's good to know the stories will continue." Outside, church bells rang once in the distance. The sound drifted across the snowy village. Thomas listened carefully. Then he stood and began the slow walk home. Behind him remained the voices of neighbors. Ahead of him waited a warm hearth, and somewhere between those two things rested a life well lived. The famine had shaped him, but it had never defined him. The hunger had tested him, but it had never defeated him. In the end, the thing people remembered most was not what he endured. It was what he preserved, the memory of ordinary people surviving extraordinary hardship, a memory now safely carried by a new generation. And as winter settled deeper over Ashmere, the village understood something important. Stories survive because someone chooses to tell them, and someone chooses to listen.